During the first quarter of 2020, the Federal Reserve printed more than $2 trillion with more on the way. This Fed's endless printing of US dollars is resulting in a new consequence from one of the largest holders of American debt, that is China. According to the Chinese news agency, China, which is the second largest foreign creditor, has decided not to wait for the devaluation of the US dollar and is now actively selling American debt. Aside from the massive printing of US dollars, another major issue for the Chinese has been the talking of the Fed of moving to negative interest rates. Now, as of Wednesday afternoon, the Fed announced it would not pursue that policy of negative interest rates at this time. But the discussion of negative interest rates has been going on for several months now. One of the qualities of money is its value. Once it's devalued, it becomes a tasteless salt. Besides, the US has been weaponizing the dollar all in the name of unlawful sanctions. China's decision is just the tip of the iceberg. Independent countries with backbone will follow suit. The entire world is fed up with America, even vassals are treated as enemies to be threatened into submission. China is unloading US treasuries because they know that America is going to bankruptcy, and there is no way the US can pay off its debt. This will send shockwaves through the global economy. China is now ditching the US debt that it holds over fears of the falling value of the US dollar, in an attempt to unseat the preeminence of the US dollar in global commerce. China owns more than $1 trillion US debt. Yesterday the Fed was on the edge of lowering the interest rates below zero. With all the QE, the zero interest rates, and the unlimited printing by the Fed, China saw the tsunami coming that will eventually crash the US dollar, and they are getting out of the way while they still can. The Fed may now buy up all the debt that the Chinese sell and use it to keep their knee on the neck of our nation. Our debt is beyond payable, and the symptoms will show up, leading to the collapse of the country and the dollar. The US debt stands currently at $26 trillion with trade deficits in the multi-billions of dollars. Add in the monthly interest payments in the multi-billions of dollars to service debt loads. You have a realistic picture of a truly insolvent or bankrupt US. It's all over but the screaming, folks. Why should China keep useless paper? All the United States is doing is printing paper money backed by nothing. This was bound to happen. The US is now in trouble. The US dollar is backed by ultra-reliable made-in-China printers. The federal budget deficit widened to $399 billion in May from $208 billion a year earlier. The U.S. government's budget deficit rose 92% in May from a year earlier to $399 billion, as revenues plummeted and spending surged. The U.S. dollar is getting weaker by the day. Powell openly admits that millions will not be returning to their jobs. Unemployment claims added another 1.5 million last week. 25,000 stores are predicted to close definitely this year. Mnuchin says over the next month, another $1 trillion will be pumped into the economy. Into the markets. Total U.S. debt increased by $1 trillion in just a month. Fed sees rates near zero through 2022 and said it would continue with asset purchases. Federal Reserve officials on Wednesday forecast that its benchmark rate will stay near zero through 2022 and that the asset purchases would stay at the current pace. This is getting scary. The federal bank now holds over $7 trillion in debt. It was half of that just 3 months ago. Can't blame the Chinese. The US is rapidly becoming one of the most unstable countries on earth. Debt default and rapid collapse of US currency are now a distinct possibility. America is bankrupt, and the Fed will eventually fail. What they are doing is setting the price of assets to be much higher than market demand would indicate. They are stuck in a cycle of having to provide more and more support, cheap credit, asset buying, explicit guarantees for creditors for every decrease in demand. It may take years, but when the Fed fails, those assets will be priced at market value. China has made it clear it's not going to buy more US debt, and it will start selling all US debt. This is a real threat to the US and the dollar. The US needs places to soak up its debt. If China is selling US treasuries, then not only does the US have to soak them up, but it also loses a place to sell them. Henceforth, a double whammy effect that multiplies the effect of the initial sale. China is the second largest owner of US government debt, holding more than $1.1 trillion worth of treasuries. China's diversifying out of dollars has been underway for some time but picked up speed early last year. Those moves coincided with a surging appetite for government debt that's pushed down yields. The dollar is fast losing its place as an international currency. The list of countries using euros to buy and sell oil grows every year. The global sale of oil and natural gas in US dollars is what has kept the US dollar stable. China could weaponize its holdings and flood the markets with US bonds. This is worse than a nuclear attack on US soil. Some may think, well, even if China does sell the debt, it will have a minimal effect because the Fed would immediately buy it up. Why does it matter if China has $1 trillion in US debt? We are spending $5.3 trillion in stimulus boosts in 6 months. What difference does it make if they sell $1 trillion debt? We can just print more money and buy back the debt. Consider that if the US were to devalue the bonds to China by printing worthless money as China calls in its notes, what does it do to our other allies, Britain, Netherlands, France, etc.? That would create a disaster in the World Bank that would result in a depression that would make the current one look like a mild recession. China got us by the short and curly guys. That hurts like hell to say this, but this thing gave them some serious leverage. As the US creditability is sinking like a free-falling knife, the security of the reserve is much more important than the interests. China will sell all their bonds as soon as possible, just like the Russians did. The US prints money out of thin air, then helicopter the money to save the US, which will cost a great devaluation of everybody's reserve currency. The world is watching nervously. The day of the dollar collapsing is looming. China played us to the point of crushing our economy and adding trillions to our federal deficit. This pandemic may have been a payback for the tariffs. We will add 10 to 15 trillion in debt to our deficit. While they experienced minimal damage and purchased all the cheap oil on the market when crude crashed, to rebuild their economy within a year with minimal stimulus compared to our mountains of debt. While our dollar gets decimated and we have inflation kicking